This morning we're going to spend some time in the biblical book of Esther, and so I want to invite you to take out a Bible or open up a tablet or get out a phone, Android or iPhone. We don't discriminate around here. And go ahead and cue that up to the book of Esther. What we're going to be doing is taking kind of a survey through the book of Esther and exploring the structure of it in just kind of a flyby procedure. And what we'll do is note some things along the way, but our intention really is at the end of the thing to look at it and say, what does this story tell us about our own individual stories? And what do we learn about God and how He works in people's lives that can really give us courage and hope? And my prayer is that you'll find this message to be something that's encouraging to you in the middle of life where you find yourself. So we're going to be spending some time in the book of Esther. I'll go ahead and pray, and then we'll jump right into it. Lord, again, it's a joy to worship you on a beautiful day and to be reminded of the blessings you pour into our lives through fellowship, through the shelter that we have, through moms and dads and people that have shown us love and compassion. And Lord, right now, we look to you in a special way, and we want to hear from you. All of us came in here with things we were thinking about, some heavy, some light, some joyful, some sorrowful. But we came in with life. And Lord, we're expecting that you'll speak to us right in the midst of that. And so quiet down the voices on our head that need quieted. Turn up the volume on your voice. Help us to listen and to really hear not from a person, but from Jesus himself today. And so we ask for your Spirit to do that miracle because we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. The book of Esther is really an amazing little book. It's 10 chapters long. And I wanted to set the backdrop just before we jump into looking at the structure of it. The book of Esther finds itself as a continuation of the story that the Bible has been telling all along. And so if you're someone that's new to the Bible, just in a nutshell, it starts off by saying that God creates a good and amazing world, and he puts people into the middle of it and essentially gives them the command to flourish and enjoy what he's made. They quickly break that world, and so that ushers in the brokenness and pain that we experience as the mixed lot of both joy and sorrow that we find ourselves living in today. There are things that make us feel absolutely exuberant, and there are things that steal our joy at times and make us ask hard and difficult questions and feel a lot of pain. And the Bible sets out to remind us and to tell us and to encourage us that God hasn't left us in the middle of that. It really tells us that joy is essential to life and that pain and sorrow is an intrusion into God's plan. And so it quickly begins to tell the story of how God is going to set things right, to unroll the curse that's entered into the world, and to usher in joy, to usher in peace, reconciliation. And so central to that plan is that God is eventually going to come down himself as a baby, and he'll be God with us. He'll identify with our pain, with our sorrow. He'll take all of the brokenness and wicked of the world onto himself so that by giving his life, he can give us the hope of new life that's not marked by pain and sorrow and regret. And so central to this story that the Bible's telling is that the way that God is going to introduce himself into the world as a baby is on the tail ends of a family tree. In fact, he's going to be part of an ongoing story that's told for thousands of years in which there's a family that's specially set apart, not for the purpose of being blessed particularly, but for the purpose of unleashing blessing on the rest of the world. And so we know that family as the 12 tribes of Israel, or the children of Abraham. And in the early pages of the Bible, we read their story of being supernaturally guided and taken care of by God, but then largely rejecting him at times. And so there's this undulation, there's this movement where it's like they come close to God and they want to be part of what he's doing in the world, and then they run away from it and they don't want to have anything to do with that anymore. And through the midst of all that, God is faithful. But as any faithful parent, as any wise mom knows, part of raising your children is to find a disciplinary method that communicates effectively to whatever your child needs, right? There are some of your children that have made the words time out a bad word in your vocabulary, right? There are some children you threaten timeout and they're ready to comply. Others, you tell them, hey, you're on timeout, and they think, man, solitary confinement is for me. That's what they enjoy. And so you recognize that part of parenting is having, like Betty mentioned, the wisdom to see who your children really are and to communicate with them in a way that connects. And so God eventually does that, and we find that the remaining tribes of this family of Abraham are taken into exile. And so this is where we read the story of Daniel, who's marched through the desert and taken captive in Babylon, put in Babylonian schools. And so there becomes this Jewish population that's living in Babylon. And eventually the Babylonian kingdom who's ruling over them is deposed, and there's a new kingdom that comes on the scene, the Medo-Persian Empire. And God uses this group of people to usher in a return for the exiles so that they can go back to their homeland. And so eventually the rulership of the Medo-Persian Empire issues an invitation and enables people, provides them with aid so that they can return to their own homeland. And at this time, God stirs the hearts of various prophets and encourages his people to return back to Jerusalem, back to Israel, and to rebuild what has been torn down. And so there's this return. That's where we find books like Ezra and Nehemiah telling the story of how the Israelites are leaving captivity, leaving their exile, and returning to their homeland. But the book of Esther finds us situated in the Medo-Persian kingdom, in the capital city, and we find that there's a significant Jewish conglomerate. There's a significant population of Jewish people living in and around this area that have rejected the message of the prophets inviting them to return from exile and to go home. And instead, they basically say, hey, we lived here all our lives. It's good enough for us. We're just sticking around. They don't have a desire after 70, 80, 90 years to go back to a home that they haven't really known. They stay right where they are. And so this is where Esther picks up. We find a small Jewish community, or a rather large Jewish community actually, that's living as exiles, having rejected the prophet's invitation for them to go home. And we find a series of vignettes in this story that really raises a lot of questions about God and what he's doing. Raises questions like, has God rejected us? Are we still part of his plan? Does he care? And what I want to do is to just take some snapshots, just snapshots through the story of Esther that I think are going to kind of help us explore that a little bit. And the first one comes as we open the book of Esther. In Esther's chapter 1 and 2, what we find is that there's this great king. Xerxes is his Persian name. Ahasuerus is his Greek name. And he's ruling over 120 different provinces. And he gets this idea after he's been reigning for not very long that it's time for some partying. Those of you that teach recognize it's getting to be about that time where homework is largely replaced by thoughts of end-of-the-year parties. And there's something in his soul that stirs, and he says, okay, it's time to party, but he doesn't want just a day-long affair. He sets up 180 days of partying. And he invites everyone to come party. And the alcohol is flowing freely. And then at the end of his 180 days of partying, he says, you know what would really cap this off? More partying. And so he institutes another week-long party. And at the end of that party, we find him, the scriptures say in Esther chapter 1, verse 10, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. It's a little bit of an understatement. After partying for half a year, this guy is now drunk, and he decides that the capstone of his partying now is going to be to invite his beautiful wife, Queen Vashti, into the assembly so that he can display her, surpassing beauty to all his cronies that are also drunk. Well, she gets word of it, and it doesn't sound like a very appealing invitation, right? Hey, come parade yourself in front of all these drunk guys. So based on her nobility, she refuses that command. Well, these drunken men are incensed at this great disgrace that they feel has been shown to them. And so they say to the king, if you do this, and just don't, if you let her get away with this without some sort of punishment, then all the wives throughout the entire nation are going to feel like they can just disregard what their husbands say. So king, you got to do something and show that you're the man. And so then the king says, that sounds like a great idea. Remember the presence of alcohol in this story. The king says, that sounds like a great idea. And so they issue a decree that goes something like this. Wives, listen to your husbands. Love King Xerxes. And so they decide that in order to demonstrate that this is really a powerful statement, they depose Queen Vashti, and she will no longer come before King Xerxes again. And so then this is on display here in Esther chapters 1 and 2. It's this display of the king's greatness, his pomp, the celebratory nature, his riches, all these things are at display. But as we come to the tail end of chapter 1 and 2, by this time, we're introduced to a young woman that we don't know a lot about, but she becomes prominent in the story, and it's for her that the book is named in Esther chapter 2 and verse 5. I'm in Esther chapter 2 and verse 5. If you've got that, just go ahead and say amen. Esther 2 and verse 5. It says, in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was what? Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. All that to say he was a descendant from the family of Israel. It continues on in verse 7 and says, Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And so we're introduced now to Esther, and she's introduced as an orphan. So she's in an incredibly vulnerable position. She's an orphan from an exiled community living under the seat of this great empire, the Medo-Persians. But Mordecai has been faithful to raise her and treat her as his own. And so she is part of this beauty pageant that's put on in order to find a new queen to replace Vashti. And the story goes that she eventually wins the beauty pageant, and she becomes the queen over the entire nation. But she's sort of a queen on demand. Part of her role is that she only goes to see the king when he calls for her specifically. And we finish the chapter, this section describing King Ahasuerus' greatness in Esther chapter 2 and verse 21. And we find that Mordecai uncovers a plot. We'll read about it. Esther chapter 2 verse 21. If you're there, just say amen. All right. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. There's a short little vignette as the story begins to build, in which Mordecai, as a keeper of the gate, becomes aware that there's a plot, there's a plan to take King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus' life. And so when he finds out about this, he reveals the plan to Esther. Esther, in her communication with the king, reveals that to him. He makes an inquiry, they investigate, they find that it's true, and they execute these two traitors. Now, after all this happens, it's interesting that this is written down in a book, but nothing comes of it. Now, you can imagine if you're Mordecai and you just saved the king's life through this situation, you might be thinking, anticipating that something good is going to happen. You're going to get a bonus, at least some recognition, a little thank you card, something to say, hey, thanks for saving my life. But nothing happens. This concludes our first section, the king's greatness. Now, in our second little vignette, we have a man by the name of Haman, and he's elevated. He begins to gain prominence, and that picks up in Esther chapter 3 and verse 1. Do you have that? All right, Esther 3, verse 1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, For Mordecai had told them that he was a what? Jew. Now, this is a really interesting little tidbit because Mordecai has instructed Esther not to mention her ethnicity at all. She's living in the king's palace, but they don't know that she's part of this exiled community of the Jews. But apparently what happens is Haman is elevated in position and people are supposed to notice him. Right? Like when he walks by, the people at the water cooler are supposed to do something to show their deference, to show that they respect him. And so that's Haman's expectation, but Mordecai is not complying with this. And so he gets angry. And apparently, Mordecai's associates are also confronting him about it. And they're saying, hey, why aren't you bowing down? Why aren't you showing some sort of deference to Haman? And we don't have any sort of explicit account of what he says to them. But it seems likely that at the heart of that is an explanation where he says, I'm a Jew and we worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we don't bow down. We don't worship other people. We only bow down to serve the living God. And so when these associates of Mordecai then confront Haman and they say, hey, why doesn't this guy bow down to you? He's a Jew. Apparently, they've come to understand that, and it seems likely that the reason why is that Mordecai has explained to them how he worships the true God. But we're just given little hints at it. Verse 5 says, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he was so angry that he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. And so in this scene then, we have Haman is elevated to a position of prominence, but there's some friction that ensues, and this leads to our next little vignette in which Haman sends out a decree, and the decree essentially says in 11 months, it's open season on anyone of Jewish ancestry. Man, woman, child, doesn't matter. Destroy them and take all of their resources as plunder. And so what happens is Haman devises this plan. He doesn't just want to get back at Mordecai. He wants to destroy the people of Mordecai and wipe out the Jews living in this kingdom. Now, part of the story that's heightened at this point is that if we remember that the story of Esther is being told about a community of people who have largely rejected what the prophets have told them to do. These are Jewish people that are living in exile, but they could have gone home. So when this affair ensues, you have this sense of like what's going to happen because they haven't listened to what God told them to do. Right? Like, are they going to be destroyed or not? Now, we continue on in our story. After Haman's decree, Esther and Mordecai plan to somehow reverse the decree. And this is one of the most profound sections, profound narratives in the entire Bible. It just has all the makings of a great drama, a great play. The pieces fit together in such an elaborate way. It happens that when Mordecai finds out about this decree that Haman has made and issued, and part of the problem is that the Medes and Persians have this rule that when they make a decree, you can't go back on it. Some of you moms might relate to that. You know, like your kid did something, and then that vein on your head popped out, and so you said, I'm gonna, and then when you cool down a little bit, you wish you hadn't said, I'm going to, but then you kind of feel like, since I said I'm going to, now I've got to, and so your kid's crying, and you're like, oh, I'm a terrible mom. You know, one of those moments. And this happens with the Medes and Persians. They say, oh, this is a great idea, let's do it, and then they can't take it back. So when Mordecai finds out about this, he puts on basically a burlap sack instead of clothes. He puts ashes in his hair. He's disheveled, and he's screaming, he's groaning, he's moaning, crying out, and he walks toward the king's palace, toward the gate there, and he's stationed outside because he can't go in looking like this, but he's stationed outside, and he's mourning and lamenting what's going to happen to his people. Now, Esther catches wind of this, and so she sends a delegation to ask Mordecai what's wrong, and they bring him a change of clothes. And when that delegation comes to him, he says, I'm not changing. And so the delegation goes back to Esther and says, Esther, this is what he said to us. And through this, she learns of the decree that's been levied, and she's immediately beginning to think, I've got to do something to help, but she's in a bind, right? because the rule is she's the queen, but only when the king calls for her. And so you get this amazing interchange by means of a messenger that's going back and forth. But in Esther chapter 4 and verse 10, Esther speaks and she communicates the bind that she is in to Mordecai. Implicit in Mordecai's message to the queen, to Esther, through this messenger is the idea that she needs to do something because of her position. But her response is essentially, man, it's not so easy as you think. So I'm in Esther chapter 4, verse 10. If you got that, just go ahead and say amen. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. Now she sends this message, and it's informed by understanding the king's character, right? Like, she knows what's happened to Queen Vashti. She knows the kind of impetuous, turbulent person the king is. And so if you say, hey, I want you to go in before this guy that tends to be kind of a mean drunk at times, and if he's happy to see you, everything's fine. But if he's not happy to see you, you're done for. The stakes are pretty high, right? And so Mordecai seems to be saying, hey, go do something. And she's saying, look, I could end up dead just as easy as not. So when Mordecai gets this message, he sends a word back. And you can imagine the pain that must have been on his heart when he's sending this message back. Not communicating it face to face, but this is the child that he's rescued from being an orphan and raised himself. There's a tenderness in their relationship that lets you know that he values her immeasurably. And yet he's going to ask her to do something that puts her very life in jeopardy. And so she gets this message back, Mordecai, verse 13. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. An amazing statement, right? It's the statement of great confidence that the Jews will not be cast aside and permanently lost, that there will come deliverance into the situation. He doesn't know how it will come. He's in angst and anguish about what's happening, but he knows that deliverance is coming. And so he issues this invitation to Esther, and he basically says, deliverance is going to come, but do you want to participate in it or not? Because your personal destiny is wrapped up in the future of your people. And then he goes on and he raises this poignant, pregnant question. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? See, there's this sense in which Mordecai has a faith that all is not lost. And when he's looking at the situation that seems desperate, he has his eyes open and he's saying, maybe it's not just coincidence that you find yourself where you are. Maybe there's a purpose behind it. Maybe there's a reason that you're right where you are in this moment. So he says to her, deliverance will come, but it's in peril of your own life if you don't participate with it. And so this then moves us into our next vignette, our next scene, where Esther gets this idea that she's going to call a banquet. And so bravely, she responds to Mordecai and says, okay, I will fast for 3 days with my people, and you fast with your people for 3 days, and then I'll go in, and if I die, I die. So she comes in before this turbulent, impulsive king, and in a good mood that day, he holds out his scepter and says, what can I do for you? And she says in that moment, you can imagine her trying to steel her knees to keep them from trembling. She says, I'd like to invite you to a special banquet tomorrow. And I want you to bring along a guest, Haman, the Agagite. And so this transpires then where they have a banquet, and it's just the king and Haman there. And in Esther chapter 5, verse 6, Esther chapter 5, verse 6, if you've got that, just go ahead and say amen. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." And then it seems like that would be the moment where she says, okay, up to half the kingdom, I'll tell you the problem. And we don't know what's going on in her mind. We don't know if it's like this is her plan or if she gets afraid and backs off when she looks at Haman. But she says, okay, come to a banquet that I'll prepare for you tomorrow, and then I'll tell you. And the king at that point says, okay, I'm in. Now, the story couldn't be any more interesting. In verse 9, it says, so Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. Right? Like he's on top of the world. He's gotten the decree against the Jews. He's been invited to the special banquet that was only held for the king and for him. He's been promoted. He's in charge of so much. Things are just sunshiny for Haman. But on his way out, coincidentally, he passes Mordecai in the king's gate and notices that he did not stand or tremble before him. And so he was filled with indignation yet again. Verse 10 says, nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. You know, so you get this picture, he comes home and he's just like, life is awesome. I'm rich. I have a bunch of kids. I have power. I have fame. I get invited to the special banquet. But then he says, yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. See, he knows in 11 months what's going to befall the Jews and Mordecai, but he thinks Mordecai is wrecking his happiness in this moment, so I have to be rid of him now. And so his family counsels him that you should construct a gallows and hang him. So Haman thinks this is a great idea. He has it constructed, and he goes to bed. And tomorrow, he's going to go in before the king and tell the king, I want to have Mordecai killed. So now he can finally rest easy. But the story takes another turn. And though this is familiar for most of us, maybe, for many of us, the details are just fascinating. It says that night, I'm in Esther chapter 6 and verse 1, that night the king could not sleep. You know how it goes sometimes. You got things on your mind, something that's just keeping you up. Maybe you slept too much or previously and you just can't fall asleep. Mothers, you know all about this when your kids just won't fall asleep. And so you try to find some way to get them to go to sleep. And so finally, the king says, hey, let's bring some people in so they can read me from our official storybook. And while they're reading the story, it happens to be at the place on the scroll where Mordecai uncovers the plot to kill King Xerxes and saves his life. And then he sits up and like many of us that have things on our to-do list that haven't gotten done yet, and he sits up in his bed and he says, hey, what did we do for him to say thank you? And they said, absolutely nothing. And the king thinks, oh, this is ridiculous. He saved my life. We've got to do something grand for him. And so just as he's thinking about what can we do for him, in walks happy Haman with his plot to overthrow Mordecai. You can just imagine him sort of whistling. He walks in there, and the king sees him, and he says to Haman, the king draws him in there, and he says to Haman, I'm in Esther chapter 6 and verse 6. Esther chapter 6 and verse 6. If you're there, just say amen. All right. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And when Haman hears that, he can't think of anything that could possibly be happening here other than the king is asking what Haman wants done to honor him. Because Haman can't think of anyone else besides himself that the king should honor. Self-absorbed. And so Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman. That's kind of what the is in Haman's mind. And he's just like, you can just imagine how he's fantasizing about this, looking forward to this moment where he's riding around on the king's horse. This is going to be the day. He's thinking about how his friends are going to react. But then his heart is crushed in a moment. Verse 10, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. Like Shakespeare can't come close to this. So Haman does begrudgingly what he's required to do, going around announcing, thus is done for the one the king desires to honor. Jerk. Right? He's just hating that whole moment. Finally, this day can't end soon enough, and he gets to go home. So he goes home, and he says to his family, you won't believe how miserable my life is. Guess what happened? And his wife looks at him and says, is Mordecai a Jew? If he is, you're not going to win. And right as they're talking about that, in walks the messenger from the king's palace and says, it's time to go to Esther's banquet again. What an amazing coincidence. And so Haman goes with them, goes to the banquet, and after eating, with all of this on his mind, the king finally looks at Esther again and says, Esther, what is it that you want? And this takes us to our next vignette, Esther's second banquet. Esther, what is it that you want? And Esther looks at the king and says, King, there is someone who has schemed to bring an end to my people, motivated by a heart of malice and wickedness. And if it were just a matter of us becoming slaves, I wouldn't have said anything to you. But because he's demanded our lives, I have to ask you for deliverance. And the king is furious, and he looks at her and says, who has done this? And she points and says, this man, Haman. And he's speechless. The king rushes out to think about what to do, leaving Esther and Haman with one of the most awkward scenes of social gathering in the history of the world. Finally, Haman begins to implore and beg Esther that she would intercede on his behalf because he knows what's in his cards. He knows what's coming for him and his family. And as this is happening, he sort of comes on top of her just as the king comes out, and the king says, you would dare to attack the queen in my palace? And he immediately orders that Haman be killed on the same gallows that he intended to have Mordecai killed on. And so what he has planned for another has come back full circle onto himself. And so after this pivot point in which Haman has to lead Mordecai through the city pronouncing honor, the story has now pivoted, and we're headed back from where we came, but the roles are now being reversed. And so we find now that Esther and Mordecai are empowered by the king to come up with a decree that would somehow save the Jews. And so they send out this decree that essentially says that the Jews can save themselves. They can gather together and they can fight against those who would have destroyed them. And so rather than being victimized and destroyed themselves, they end up being rid of their enemies. It happens then that Mordecai sends out this decree and publishes it abroad. And now, at the end in the book of Esther, we find that Mordecai has been elevated to the position of prominence that Haman once held. This great role reversal has taken place, and the book closes, Esther chapter 10, and I want to invite you to look there in verse 3, the very last verse of the book. We begin with the greatness of the king on display, but we close with the greatness of Mordecai on display. I'm in Esther chapter 10 and verse 3. If you're there, just go ahead and say amen. For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. And so we have this great reversal in which, when it seemed like it was a hopeless situation, by coincidence and happenstance, things have come together so that now the people who are on the outs are the favored people. And those that thought to do them harm, the wicked ones who were arrayed against God's chosen people, have been put aside. It's an amazing and it's a fascinating story on so many levels. It explains now why the Jews keep the Feast of Purim, where they celebrate this great deliverance that they experienced. But one of the most curious things about this story is that it's found in a book in the Bible that is distinguished from every other book in the Bible for something that you might not expect. There's something about the book of Esther that sets it apart from every other book in the entire scriptures. Some of you know what it is. It's the only book in the Bible that makes no mention of God at all. There's not a single time that God is mentioned in the book of Esther. There's not a single time that Yahweh or Jehovah, the names of God, are mentioned in the book of Esther. There's not a single time that the Lord is referred to, that the Messiah is referenced. There's not a single time that anyone says, let's pray about it. Some of you are thinking, yeah, there is, because Esther asks for prayer when she goes in before the king. But if you look at it, she says, I'm going to fast, and you fast too. And if I perish, I perish. There's no mention of God in the entire book. There are other books that don't use the word God specifically. Song of Solomon is one of them. But there are allusions to Yahweh in that book, verbal allusions. The text actually mentions it. The book of Jude doesn't use the word God, but it mentions the Lord. It mentions the return of Jesus. They're explicit in their statements about God's action in our lives. But when it comes to the book of Esther, we read through the story in which point by point, we're introduced into the most tumultuous, uncertain, desperate times that a group of people who have rejected the leading of God through the prophets have ever experienced. And then circumstances unfold in such a way and at such dramatic time that the people are saved and they find themselves celebrating this great deliverance. But at the end of the book, God is conspicuously absent. Or is he? We can read through the book of Esther with eyes that only see natural explanations. And we say, man, what are the odds that that would happen? What are the chances it would unfold like that? But the author is masterfully inviting us to consider that when you didn't think God was anywhere to be found, he's actually at every turn. See, the point of the book of Esther isn't about a bunch of awesome people who make great, awesome decisions. That's part of it, but it's morally confusing situations. There's so much drunkenness and illicit physical relationships that permeate this book, and it leaves us with so many muddled, unanswered questions about people that don't seem to actually be following what God said through the prophets. And has he rejected them or not? He's nowhere to be found. And so we look back and we say, he's been there at every turn. He's guiding the decision-making processes. He's giving people courage when they need it. He's turning the king's heart to show favor to those that are in a desperate situation. And the book of Esther then is a marvelous parable inviting us to consider the story of our own lives. See, it's possible for us to look at the tragedy and the pain and the difficulty that we experience and to say, where is God in all of this? And it's possible for us to live our lives in such a way that we look at our lives and we look at our history and we say, he's absent. He's nowhere to be found. We might say things like, I'm part of a religious community, but I feel like God's completely uninvolved with me. I have nothing to do with him. We look back at the difficulties that we face, the tragedy that's marked our lives, and say, where was he in all of that? But the book of Esther invites us to consider that rather than the absence of God being the characteristic of our story, the presence of God is the defining characteristic of our story. I was talking with a young guy the other day, mid-20s. He became agnostic in his life. He didn't know whether or not there was a God. Grew up in a religious home, but he became convinced personally that there wasn't enough evidence for him to solidly decide, is God in it or not? Where is God? If he's so good, if he's so present, then how come he isn't involved in my life? And he told me his turning point was one moment in his early 20s taking a shower. And he said, somehow, I don't know how to explain it. I became aware that God had been with me throughout my entire journey. And I looked back and I began to see how he was present in the things that I had gone through, and it's revolutionized my life. This morning I want to ask you, how is it in your story? Is it a story in which you see the marvelous hand of God orchestrating and moving? Or is it a story in which you say, where is he? I believe with all my heart that the story that the Bible is telling is a story that we're invited into. And it's a story that says that you will suffer and experience gross, disturbing darkness in life, but that God has come down as a child and as a man and has brought healing and entered into the story, so much so that when you say, what do you call God when he becomes a man? What's the name for a God that's become man? The answer from God himself is Emmanuel. God is with us. I believe with all my heart that the story that God is inviting us into is to recognize with eyes of faith that we've never actually been orphans. We've never been left, but God has always looked over us with care and concern. And I believe someday we're going to look back on all of our lives, and I don't know where your story is going to pivot, but someday we're going to look back on the story of our lives, and we're going to see that God was with us the entire time. So this morning I want to speak a word of hope and courage to whatever it is that you're facing and say, you are not forgotten. God is looking over you with an earnest and compassionate love that is absolutely dwarfing to any other force in the universe. A love that's so compelling, that's so strong, it causes the God of the universe to say, I would rather lay down my life than experience eternity without him, without her. This is the story that Jesus is inviting us to live in. The story that he's never left us and he's never forsaken us. So today, on behalf of Jesus, whatever it is that you're dealing with, I want to say to you, he's with you. Father, may we come to feel, to know, and to trust when we can't see that you're right in the midst of our story. That it's you that stands behind the shadows, orchestrating, moving things forward. So one day, we'll spend eternity with you and know your presence face to face. Give us trust and faith while we wait for that day. In the name of Christ, amen.